Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
At least 2 people killed and 64 workers affected, while 38 are under clinical care after ammonia gas leak at a seafood processing unit in Tiruvallur district of Tamil Nadu.
It's a massive corporate trend to cut costs and somehow maintain operations, if possible, 24/7. So under the old Factories Act and the new safety codes, what does the law actually say about putting worker beds right next to something dangerous like an ammonia line?
Work on construction sites must be provided housing, but it does not say what kind of housing, safe housing, dignified housing, what are the qualitative features of this housing, nothing.
Did any such compensation reach the workers that you know of?
Basically hush money settlements where workers are forced to agree to a term of settlement which is not really fair and just. So it might be a significant amount of money from the point of view of the workers, but it is hardly justice in any form or manner.
Migration should not happen in isolation. So if women are traveling together in groups with peers, that helps. That develops more confidence. What does a safer pre-departure system looks like? I think the first step is giving workers reliable, verified information before they leave home. So they know exactly who they're working for, what the job involves, what wages will they receive, what accommodation they are going to stay at. So it's a journey.
For most of us, home is where we leave the day's stress behind and feel safe. But what happens when you travel 1,500 kilometers for a job and your front door becomes an industrial steel shutter locked from the outside? For decades, the factory gate was a symbol of labor regulation, a physical boundary between your shift and your personal life. Today, across India's industrial clusters, that distinction is being slowly erased. The modern production line is increasingly an all-inclusive zone, very often residential too. And when the boundary between a hazardous industrial process and a home disappears, the definition of an occupational hazard changes completely. Take, for example, what happened in Haldwani a few weeks ago. A midnight fire broke out at a logistics warehouse operated by a third-party firm for a global e-commerce giant. Trapped inside were 2 workers who pulled a day shift and slept there to guard the goods. When the fire spread, they ran to the exit, but the main door was locked from the outside. They died inside the warehouse. Days later, in Tiruvallur, Tamil Nadu, an ammonia gas leak struck a private seafood processing factory. While one shift packaged seafood on the ground floor, nearly 60 women workers were asleep upstairs, directly above the refrigeration machinery. 18 workers died, including 15-year-old Kumani Juanga from a remote district in Odisha. Her parents didn't know where she was till the officials brought back her body. These are not isolated accidents. By December 2024, data compiled by IndustryAll recorded at least 240 major workplace accidents in India's manufacturing, mining, and energy sectors. They resulted in over 400 fatalities and 850 serious injuries. The true scale is probably much higher, as over 90% of India's workforce operates informally and goes uncounted. Even in regulated space, negligence exists. How does these impact worker safety? To look past the immediate headlines, we are joined by Dr. Isha Gupta, research lead at the Just Jobs Network and co-author of a study on rural women's migration and the road to work. Welcome, Dr. Isha.
Hi, Sandhya. Thank you so much for having me on this conversation.
We are also joined by Shreela M, human rights lawyer and researcher specializing in interstate migrant labor rights and workplace injury compliance in Tamil Nadu. Welcome, Shreela.
Hi, Sandhya. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. Let's start with you, Isha. Your research at Just Jobs looks closely at what it takes for rural women to find and keep formal jobs. When you look at the Tiruvallur tragedy through that lens, how does it help us see that this wasn't just a localized industrial accident, but it could be a feature of how interstate migration is organized?
First of all, I would like to say that this was a heartbreaking tragedy. And the immediate question that emerged, and rightly so, is that what exactly happened inside the factory? Who is accountable? How do we ensure that incidents like this never happen again? And how do we deliver justice to the affected workers and their families? And all of these questions absolutely matter. But as more details about the tragedy emerged, they also pointed to something much bigger than this one incident. For example, one instance is that the media reported that one tribal hamlet in Kyonjhar district in Odisha, which had about 200 people, at least 18 workers, including 10 women, were working in similar seafood factories across Tamil Nadu. And tragically, 2 young women from that same village lost their lives in this incident. To me, that immediately stands out because it shows that this wasn't a random or isolated case of a few individuals migrating to work. It looked like an organized migration corridors linking villages in Odisha to factories in Tamil Nadu. Another media coverage reported that many of these young workers had been recruited by someone from their own village who had earlier been a supervisor at this factory. And he had arranged jobs for these workers using fake or borrowed Aadhaar documents because some of the migrant girls were actually found to be minor. Father of one of the deceased girls from that same village who had migrated for work a few months back mentioned like she was not in touch with the family since she migrated. And the father described this whole process of recruitment as a well-organized network. When you hear all of these details, the conversation immediately shifts. Now, instead of asking only what happened inside the factory, this makes us ask bigger questions. Like why and how did so many young people from one small village with just 200 people traveled over 1,500 kilometers for work to a completely unfamiliar place? With a different language, with different culture, and with little local support. And having lived in Chennai myself for 2 years, I know that language can be a real barrier if you don't speak Tamil. And Chennai, mind you, is a large metropolitan city with comparatively better connectivity and support. So imagine how it would have been in Tiruvallur. So all of these raise a whole set of new questions. Like how were they recruited? How were these young people recruited? What information did they have before they left for jobs? Did they know what the job was about and the living conditions? How they would be like? And if something went wrong, who was responsible? And who knew that they were there? So it was an industrial accident, yes. But what I'm trying to say is that the reporting around this tragedy highlighted the realities of how interstate labor migration is organized in India.
Thanks, Isha. That was exhaustive. And looks like the patterns of migration for work has more or less remained the same informal networks through which people find jobs and leave their villages to move to faraway cities. Shreela, I'll come to you now. We know that many migrant workers choose to live off-site so that they remain independent. But now this living inside the factory as what happened at the Tiruvallur outlet. It's a massive corporate trend to cut costs and somehow maintain operations, if possible, 24/7. So under the old Factories Act and the new safety codes, what does the law actually say about putting worker beds right next to something dangerous like an ammonia line? How does the law handle this change in pattern?
Unfortunately, the law either has remained silent or, in fact, in unfortunate ways has enabled some of the degrading conditions that we are seeing, especially if you take I'll come to the Factories Act in a bit, but if you take the Building and Other Construction Workers Act, that is a specific provision which states that workers who are coming to work on construction sites must be provided housing, but it does not say what kind of housing, safe housing, dignified housing, what are the qualitative features of this housing, nothing. It only says the employers are duty bound to provide housing, but it also goes on to say that this housing must be either on the site or near the site, proximate to the site. That itself is a recipe for all kinds of disasters. And right before we had this Tiruvallur ammonia leak incident, we also were involved in supporting a large group of workers who were affected by a labor camp collapse on an L&T construction site, on a site which they had only recently come to inhabit that too. They were not there for a long time. And this entire camp collapsed and led to very severe injuries, one casualty, one reported casualty, and very severe injuries for others. And we were not in a place to even go and challenge the construction and maintenance of this living site on the construction premise itself, because the law itself allows for it. So there was no ground, technically, there was no ground that we could question that itself.
So basically, there is no fine legal parameters for having workers reside, whether at the site or outside. It is totally left up to the employer.
Yes, and this is also because construction is presumed to be a temporary job where workers are always mobile. They are not stationed in any one place for a long time. They move as the projects get over and they move with the project. So this is the assumption about migrant, not just migrant construction workers, but generally all construction workers. They don't have to stay in any one place for a long time. And somehow the statute has, made that assumption too, and they have written that into the law. Whereas Factories Act cannot make any such assumption, because factories work is manufacturing work, and generally heavy industry is supposed to be work where workers are stationed there for a number of years. So the initial assumption is that once you enter a factory, then you are there for until your retirement. Of course, nowadays we are increasingly, seeing the inversion of that logic itself by employing more and more number of casual, contract, temporary workers. But at least initially, that was not the presumption made or written into the law. So Factories Act happily ignores the question of housing itself, because factories, the occupant of a factory, the management of a factory need not bother with the question of residence is the assumption which is made under the Factories Act. So on both ends, on the construction side, where there is a presumption about mobile and temporary labor, as well as on the Factories Act, on either side, it doesn't really help workers. There is no regulatory regime which is written into the law which can favor workers.
I see. Just legally, there is not much clarity on, how the housing should be, where it should be, and what are the parameters, etc. So, Isha, into this unregulated environment, how do you think the young women, how do they move from rural India into formal employment? Your works looks into that. I mean, what does it tell us about these recruitment networks? I mean, why do families trust them? And what could be the safer process, if it's possible, before a worker leaves a village, if at all it's possible?
First of all, it's important to understand that why these recruitment networks exist, informal recruitment networks exist in the first place. They aren't always predatory by design. They emerge because formal recruitment systems often don't reach rural communities.
Absolutely.
Right? For many families, the most trusted source of information isn't advertisement or government office. It's someone they already know. So if they know somebody is working somewhere and they hear good things, that's how they develop trust. So a neighbor, a relative, or someone from that village, has been already working there. This establishing trust is incredibly powerful.
Yes.
And it helps families overcome their fear of sending young women so far away from home. But this trust can actually be exploited, which actually happened in this Tiruvallur case, right? For many girls from economically vulnerable and marginalized households, migration is one of the few pathways to formal employment. And when these local opportunities are limited, families accept these opportunities, even if they have very little information about what the jobs are, and they don't have many alternatives, so they have to accept it. So while these informal networks are very effective at getting workers into jobs, they often, don't provide the information, the accountability or support that workers need once they leave the home. So our research has found that the migration journey needs support at every stage. So not just recruitment, but also once the worker reaches the factory and beyond that. On my field study, I remember meeting two sisters who had migrated from Odisha to work in a factory in Hosur, Tamil Nadu. Even though they had each other, the first few weeks were incredibly difficult for them. That's what they told me. None of the other women they stayed with or shared a room with, because they share an accommodation, right, in the factory also. None of them spoke their language. Everything around them felt unfamiliar to them.
Okay.
They mentioned that they were feeling completely alone and they wanted to quit the job and go back home.
Okay.
But what helped them stay was the support that they received in the initial few weeks.
I see. From the factory or the...
Pradhan, we were studying Pradhan's model. So Pradhan had some staff members visit them, talk to them on the phone. They reassured them that adjusting would take time and encourage them to stay. So when we spoke to these sisters, they said that this is what gave them confidence to continue. They realized that someone was looking out for them and they were not on their own. There was support for them. So this is why a safer migration process has to go beyond recruitment. Workers need good information before they leave. They need someone they can talk to, especially in the initial adjustment period that is most vulnerable. So to answer your question, what does a safer pre-departure system looks like? I think the first step is giving workers reliable, verified information before they leave home. So they know exactly who they're working for, what the job involves, what wages will they receive, what accommodation they are going to stay at, what are the working hours, and so on and so forth. And also leaves, that they are going to be leaves, they can come back home. All of that creates safe space and, confidence in the job. And second, the families need to be part of this process. One of the practices we observed was that program staff organized meeting with parents before the girls left for jobs, answering their concerns, facilitating for some parents visits to workplace in advance or in hostels before they migrated. That helped build trust among the parents also. And then we also found, thirdly, that migration should not happen in isolation. So if women are traveling together in groups with peers, that helps. That develops more confidence. It reduces anxiety and it, makes it easier for them to adjust in a new environment.
Thank you. That's a good overview of how an ideal migration could look like. But here you are referring to a non-governmental organization called Pradhan coming in and helping out workers and also tracking how the pattern is beneficial or not beneficial. So, but there is still what you call it a accountability gap. And Shreela, I want you to come in here. A much more serious accountability gap that there is. I mean, in the period between 2018 and 2020, we had around 3,000 plus factory deaths and only around 14 convictions. And when you look at the incident that happened in Haldwani, you see informal recruitment chains ending inside a facility managed by a middleman for a global brand. So this is a classic global supply chain at work. So how can the legal framework cut through these, subcontracts and middlemen to hold the actual principal company responsible? Is that even possible?
I don't see why the law should feel inhibited against holding the guys at the top of the chain responsible at all, because there is no prohibition or nothing which stops the law from going after them. It's just that I feel there is no political will as well as legal will to do that. And especially with criminal prosecution, victims of disasters, they are permitted their own representation in criminal prosecution as well, though it is primarily the state which, leads the charge against the culprits. But those who have suffered because of the crime, who are victims of the crime, they are also entitled to their own representation and to also be part of the process in the prosecution to put forward the case. But if you take industrial accidents, that hardly ever happens, because I think one of the main reasons would also be the hush money which comes into play whenever these accidents happen. We have seen that, of course, there is enhancement of compensation sometimes by the courts, which again takes a very long time again. And then only if the next of the kin of the deceased workers come forward to at least claim that enhanced compensation. Whereas criminal prosecution hardly ever takes into confidence the workers who are directly affected by these crimes, and the families are never taken on board when the prosecution is launched. And that is also because you often see that the individuals or the companies who are responsible, they enter into settlements, basically hush money settlements, where workers are forced to agree to a term of settlement which is not really fair and just. So it might be a significant amount of money from the point of view of the workers because they do need that money, but it is hardly justice in any form or manner.
Do you remember any successful conviction of the principal party in any of the recent industrial accidents?
Not at all. Not at all. Neither to benefit workers, nor to benefit, say, pollution-affected community members who are living around these factories.
That's a very sobering reality. Thanks for that, Shreela.
Listeners, do stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
ये बैटरी लॉक करने लोग भागे बहुत 3 लड़के आए थे स्कूटी पर A Bluetooth connection, a free app, and a range of 10 to 15 meters. That's all it takes to bring an e-rickshaw to a complete halt. Passengers on board, fare uncollected, and drivers stranded. Across Delhi and other Indian cities, miscreants are exploiting an unprotected vulnerability in the battery management system of e-rickshaws, switching off vehicles remotely without the driver knowing what really happened and why.
Watch the full video on how Delhi's e-rickshaw drivers are still recovering from app attack, only on the Migration Stories YouTube channel.
Let's go back to the pattern and something that you had hinted at earlier, Isha, the languages destination hubs. So in your report also, I think you mentioned that, after the Tiruvallur incident, many were placed in different hospitals, and officials and media, they were unable to talk to these people because of language barrier. So how do they all, starting from the time they arrive, language barriers, very weak institutional support, and a lack of official records, how does it hurt worker safety and, cut them off from help when they reach a new state?
So these girls were placed in different hospitals. They did not know the language. Then there was media coverage that one young woman's family, which I also referred to before, was not in touch with her since she migrated for work a few months earlier. They only learned what had happened when officials brought her body, back home. Then at the same time, reports also said that the local labor office in her home district had no official data on tribal migrant numbers, from interior pockets, from many tribal villages. So basically
they are left, most often they are left on their own unless a non-governmental agency or some other non-state actor come in and offer some support.
Right. And, so that is why the visibility is so important. Yes, maintaining a database of migrant is important, but at the same time, it's important that the workers remain connected to their families, to support institutions in their source state and also destination.
So here you are also pointing out the state's role, in this case, not just one state, two states' role in both the origin and the destination states. How can they help people moving back and forth, and how can they support them in this new journey? And without that, people might feel totally cast off, as you explained in the case of the Tiruvallur workers who were taken to different government hospitals post the accident, and they had no idea where they were supposed to stay back or go back, and there were chaos. So
these challenges also came out in our research. Women spoke about language barriers. They reported challenges in accessing healthcare. One example that I recall now, that we spoke to some women who told us that their supervisors retained their ESIC cards, which are the health cards, which help them access the healthcare. So technically they had access to the healthcare, but in practice they were hesitant to ask for their cards or take leaves when they were sick. And, they were hesitant to even visit the factory dispensary when they fell sick. So it was because they did not feel safe or comfortable, asking for help. It was also language barriers was one reason. Unfamiliar surrounding. So all of this contributes to their hesitation.
Nice.
At one of the migrant support centers in Bangalore that we spoke to, they shared an example with us, and how a young woman worker at a factory was being denied leaves to go back home because of some family matter, because of which she was prepared to quit her job. She wanted to leave, but the support center intervened and spoke to the employer and negotiated a solution. So she was able to continue working after that. So small interventions like these can make a big difference and, help barriers that these women face at the destination state. Post-placement support is really important to navigate all of this.
Absolutely. Shreela, I'm just coming to you because I get the feeling that you deal with this daily in Chennai. Because workers, probably many of them live on factory floors. And when a crisis enormous crisis like this hits, how does it affect your work? I mean, language barriers are there, missing records that Isha just mentioned. How do you help them? As a lawyer, how do you help them trace the families that are deceased workers or represent them and get them proper compensation? How do you navigate this?
Honestly, we have not been able to extend the kind of support we would like to, Sandhya, because as I had explained even earlier to a couple of friends who were inquiring about migrant workers' representation before court, and even for purely within the remit of compensation itself, So it is mostly informal negotiation, which is somehow securing the minimal benefits which we are able to get in these cases. So if the size of the employer is quite small and they're not very influential, do not have much political and business clout, then bilateral negotiations are more effective and more speedier than going through typical channels of compensation and filing a claim, etc. And first of all, this should not be the workers or worker organizations to be doing all this, because as soon as a accident occurs or any kind of mishap occurs on a factory site or a construction site, then the necessary statutory authorities are supposed to get into action, and they are supposed to investigate, conduct inquiries, speak to all the concerned parties, witnesses, etc., and file cases themselves, but which most times doesn't happen at all. And even if there is some pressure that is exerted by worker organizations or worker families, and even then, there is no initiative by the Labor Department to go beyond the question of compensation. So, compensation is something that can be secured, but the question of culpability, or either criminal culpability or civil liability, because both these things matter in cases like these, because there is the question of criminal negligence, which of course the police will pursue, but the Labor Department also has a duty to aid and furnish the necessary materials which will help the police establish what kind of negligence was at play. The Labor Department doesn't play that role at all, and civil liability as well, because the Labor Department is equally empowered to conduct their own independent inquiries. So they have their own inspectors. They're supposed to have inspectors on the ground who have their ears to the ground and conduct these inquiries, but that is also not done. So in the middle of all this, what as lawyers or worker organizations are able to do is very, very little. So only when if workers have survived the disaster or accident and they are coming forward, or if the worker families are coming forward and they are willing to fight the fight, only then we are able to intervene in a legal way. Otherwise, it is mostly these informal negotiations and bilateral talks which are.
I understood the picture, because I was just about to ask you regarding the Tiruvallur incident. Did any such compensation reach the workers that you know of?
Yeah, we have confirmation from a few workers who have returned home and who have remained in touch with us, who have been confirming that there was some money deposited in their bank accounts. But again, whether this is the entire amount which is promised by both the states, Odisha has promised 10 lakhs, Tamil Nadu has promised 2 lakhs. So whether this entire amount has been disbursed, in how many installments was it disbursed, we do not know those details. And I'm not even sure whether workers are entirely aware of what they're entitled to, because this is the sum that has been promised, and even whether that entire sum has been deposited, and also whether this is the only amount that they are entitled to is one more important question that workers must be getting answers for, which I don't think they have been informed. Of course, we have tried from our end to inform workers that this is not the only sense of, or the only manner in which the remedy has to come through, that there is more that you are entitled to. But whether workers will eventually ultimately be willing to take forward the legal fight for that, we don't know.
I see. And other thing that is related to this and came up earlier also, in the Haldwani incident, I was reading that a victim's family took a private payout because they said that they didn't have the strength or resources to go for a legal battle. So do you think that these private settlements, hush money, impact the enforcement aspect? I mean, they use the payouts to dodge investigations, do they, companies?
They do, and especially if as you had earlier mentioned about these large supply chain companies where the top of the supply chain, it is not even inside the country, but they are headquartered elsewhere. And if they decide that they will conduct their own so-called internal inquiries and fix liability, it is very easy for them to then convince the authorities, the domestic authorities, the national authorities also, that they have done due diligence processes. So the prosecution doesn't really enter into the realm of whether the supply chain, the buyer at the top of the supply chain, whether they are responsible for what happened at the end of the supply chain as well. So the authorities do not really pursue this because they are convinced by these foreign buyers that they have done their due diligence. So liability has been fixed. So why the prosecution agencies need to stop at that, we do not really understand, because there is, as I pointed out earlier, there is no prohibition in the law which tells the prosecution to know that the buck stops there, that the buck stops with lowest in the supply chain alone. So this is one part of it. And the hush money, of course, I think there are more complications to it than simply the silencing of the families alone, because sometimes what these big companies do is they try to play off one victim's family or one victim against another by playing divide and rule, basically. So they make it conditional that they will come to the bargaining table to negotiate the compensation or to negotiate the other remedial. For example, if the workers are by the sole breadwinners in their families and if they have not survived the accident, then what happens to their pension, what happens to their future, whether any other member of their family will secure employment in the same company, compassionate appointment as we call it in legal terms. So all these are questions which are to be negotiated by the management, ideally in the presence of the government authorities. But even if it is solely bilateral talks, it has become very easy for these big companies to really have the upper hand and not really come for amicable good faith negotiation at all. And they also somehow manage to have the labor department on their side as well, so that labor department does not anymore play the role of a neutral arbiter or defend workers' rights in any sense. So all these are complications which, so unless the workers and victims are really united and they are, for example, if they have formed some kind of victim association, or as we saw in the Bhopal gas tragedy, historically the Association of Victims and Survivors, they have fought the good battle for many number of years. So unless there is that kind of spirited unity and strength, it is very easy for employers to play off one victim against the other as well.
Okay. That is good to know. And in this case, the system is increasingly looking like to be stacked against workers, especially migrant workers who are coming out of their villages for the first time, very young, probably minors, all kind of disadvantages, including their socioeconomic backgrounds. So maybe if we work backwards and see what else can be fixed in this. So Isha, your research shows that, and you've also stated that protecting workers can't start after they land the factory. So, and you also mentioned the center set up by the Jharkhand state government in Bangalore. So can you tell us what does this center do and what more can these kind of support system, help the lives of migrant workers?
So they know who all are coming, if placements happen through formal systems, these youngsters travel in groups. They have a orientation session where these workers are told about how the life looks like in the new city. So these young people, know that there are other peers also in the same situation. So all of that helps. And they also organize regular meetups where these youngsters come and young workers come and meet each other. They have a place where familiar language is there. And all of this, I think, works. But the challenges are that there's one center for whole of, South India.
Yeah, okay.
We need to scale that up. What is needed?
Great. And Shreela, what do you have to add to this? Do you have any response to this, especially from an enforcement standpoint?
I'm at a loss of words because, as you very well summed it up, it is becoming bleaker. The situation that we are seeing in terms of migration is becoming bleaker because in this particular ammonia leak, over and beyond every other aspect of this tragedy, the most troubling aspect was that the largest number of workers from Odisha were also underage. So they were minors and they were children who were put in hazardous work. So even with all the protections that so-called Child Labour Abolition Act provides in terms of not placing children in hazardous work, this has happened. And which is exactly why the long-standing demand of all child rights activists and labour activists has been that children should first of all never be employed in any kind of work. And they should have the right to education and right to free education, etc. So the kind of enforcement lacuna, and not just lacuna, but utter looking away, I would say, utter negligence of the enforcement agencies also has to be really reckoned with, I would say. And even now, those of us who are working on the Tiruvallur issue, a large number of unions, trade unions as well, have been demanding that both in Odisha as well as in Tamil Nadu, the agencies who looked away, who very well knew that because Tiruvallur is, as a district, is notorious for bonded labor, child labor, and there is no way that such a large factory employing such a large number of workers could have been just allowed to function with the authorities being blind to it. That could not have happened at all. So there was willful looking away. And which is why trade unions have been demanding both in Odisha and in Tamil Nadu that the Odisha Labour Department officials, including district level officials who are supposed to work for the benefit of the Joanga tribe who have been majorly affected in this tragedy, they have looked away. As well as in Tamil Nadu, for several years, this factory has, though there have been inspections conducted by the Pollution Control Board, by the Labour Inspectorate and everything, there was no prosecution which could have completely hindered such a major disaster from unfolding. So there has been a call for also action against these erring officials who we know also are prone to corruption, who are, they are prone to being influenced by these company representatives because these officials, they tend to be posted in one particular location for a very long time. They are very familiar with all the local management representatives and so on. So all these are really strong recipe for major regulatory failures. And this is something that has been highlighted with the Tiruvallur incident. So this is, I think, one serious recommendation that needs to be followed through.
I agree. And is there anything in the new codes, the OSH code, that...
No, in fact, it goes multiple steps backwards to say that many of these offenses can be compounded, meaning they can be compromised and settled. At least with the older laws, we had some measure of some checks and balance where certain offenses, they were not compromisable, they were not compoundable. But the new law goes really takes a leap to say that many of these serious offenses can be settled as long as both parties to the issue are willing to do that. And we know how that will play out with very uneven bargaining positions for the management and for workers. We know what that will mean.
Any final thoughts from both of you?
Yeah, so I think one important lesson, at least, or what we have managed to take away from this series of instances that we have now been working on is that I think there is a need definitely for wider geographical coordination as well. So we cannot focus our work only on the destination state side of it, but we are feeling compelled to also reach out to activists and organizers or trade union leaders who are working on the other side of the migration corridors as well. So without that kind of coordination, I think our efforts will stand to be defeated very easily. So that is one major lesson that we are learning from all of this. And Odisha, at least we have been able to establish that kind of connection with local, including Adivasi rights activists who have been for a very long time part of protests and struggles against forced displacement and anti-mining projects and so on. So yeah, I think that kind of connection is very important because this is ultimately a structural issue, and structural issues also need, I think, that coordination to be addressed effectively.
Perfectly summed, because it is a systemic issue. It's a structural deficiencies that are coming up again and again. And if businesses can operate across geographies, then the rest of us workers and those who want to help workers can also do, I guess. Isha, do you have any final thoughts?
I completely agree with Shreela and you, and I think she summed up really well. So the shift we need is from reacting to these tragedies, when we see it in the news and then reacting to it, to building systems that actually prevent them. So that's my last thought to this conversation.
Great. Dr. Isha Gupta and Shreela M, thank you for explaining the real picture behind these very real human rights issues. Migration compounds many of the struggles or issues that are already there at workplaces, power imbalances, gender imbalances, and many other things. So to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. You can read the full reporting on these cases at the Migration Story website. Until next time, stay safe and thank you.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.